I'm Merritt, and I'll be presenting the 5 modules in this mini-course concerned with perspectives on study. We'll talk about the effect and effectiveness of various ways of engaging with any subject, so that as we proceed with our studies and our lives, we can effectively use these tools for thought and be more aware of their sometimes unconscious effects on our thinking when we think about or study anything, including the Urantia book. Here are the 5 modules we'll be working on together. This one, frames of reference. Then we're going to look at the Urantia book as an example from 4 different viewpoints: as a generic object, as a book, as a primary religious text, and as your primary religious text. Each frame of reference orients us differently toward the object of our study, allows us to see and consider different aspects of it, and ask different questions of it. So we're going to use these modules to take a look at what attributes the Urantia book inherits from each category, to see how they might affect our interpretations of what we read in it. This will help us to tease out some of the assumptions inherent in our usual frames of reference of which we're not normally aware. We come into each situation in our lives, into each encounter with the Urantia book, with a host of unconscious assumptions and preconceptions, all of which appear to be so reasonable to us that they pass right by without attracting our attention at all. They come to us as if inherent in the situation, as if they're actually built into whatever it is we're thinking about. This isn't a good thing in most situations, but in dealing with what one might consider to be a revelation direct from God's messengers, it can be downright dangerous. In the separate short course on frames of reference, we explore in much more detail various ways of framing our thinking and our lives, with particular attention to religious and philosophical ideas, again, both as examples and as tools for further thought. But for today's discussion, we'll take a not too serious look at frames of reference, which we might subtitle, "What Do You See?" As we proceed, it'll be obvious that we're not really talking only about physical sight, but also about interpretive insight, and even the intellectual perception of spiritual things. We'll begin with a little excursion. No, this isn't Urantia, it's Mars, of course, and it's the setting for what follows. This is how Mars looked to astronomer Percival Lowell. It's a drawing he made about 1905. At that time, he was convinced of the reality of canals on Mars. You can see them here. The existence of these apparently artificial constructions on Mars was a popular idea in the late 19th century, when several astronomers first reported such features, until the advent of more advanced telescopes in the early 20th century, which demonstrated that these intricate designs were actually optical illusions. And the possibility of life on Mars has continued to be an exciting idea right on down to the present. Vast canyons are indeed found on Mars, and those canyons, or canals, set the stage for our next slide. Wait a minute, maybe I put the wrong slide in here. This doesn't look like anything at all, does it? Just some odd shapes in purple, pink, and black. Let me see. Oh, that's right. It's cover art from the 1938 first edition of C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet. The story takes place on Mars, and this image is an evocation of the landscape of that planet. In the story, Lewis's protagonist, Dr. Ransom, had been kidnapped here on Earth. Earth is the silent planet of the title, and then taken by his captors to Mars. When the spaceship landed in one of the large canyons, Ransom knew he was on another planet, but he had no other context. He didn't even know it was Mars. So when he climbed out of the ship and first saw Mars without a usable frame of reference, this is what happened. He scrambled through the hatch and rose to his feet. He gazed about him, and the very intensity of his desire to take in the new world at a glance defeated itself. He saw nothing but colors, colors that refused to form themselves into things. Moreover, he knew nothing yet well enough to see it. You cannot see things till you know roughly what they are. Lewis describes at some length Ransom's trying to see what he was looking at. Colors and shapes made no sense. He couldn't separate the background from the things closer at hand. Transitions between colors and textures couldn't be interpreted at all. Then finally, he was able to see the water of the lake in front of him. It looked a little different than water on Earth, but it was water nonetheless. That gave him a starting point, and from there, he slowly began to distinguish objects from each other and from the environment in which they all existed. This observation by Lewis is the key thought here. You cannot see things till you know roughly what they are. We'll come back to Dr. Ransom later for another insight, but for now, we'll leave him on Mars while we return to Earth. You don't have to be visiting another world to have trouble understanding what you see. Even familiar earthly things can prove to be not quite what you thought them to be. So let's move from fiction to real life. Here's a short series of photographs. In each of them, there's an animal. You won't have long to look, but can you see them? Did you see them? I hope you found a few, but don't feel bad if you didn't. I missed almost all of them until I had much longer to study the pictures. Now, once more, and I'll show you what's there. Were you surprised at what you could and couldn't see? Separating these animals from their surroundings wouldn't have been a problem for one of our cave-dwelling ancestors, who either immediately perceived the animals around him, or he went hungry, or he was eaten. You and I have reasonably mature and accurate ideas about the world, but in many of these cases, we couldn't see what was right there in front of us, unlike our primitive ancestor, because our initial way of looking at the worlds in these pictures was ineffective. It didn't orient us properly and so couldn't serve our purpose. Our unfamiliarity with the settings and our preconceptions about what we might be seeing could even blind us to what was actually there. So, what does all that have to do with study or thinking about anything, much less with philosophy, religion, or personal growth? Here's a short paragraph from the Urantia book. Partial, incomplete, and evolving intellects would be helpless in the master universe, would be unable to form the first rational thought pattern, were it not for the innate ability of all mind, high or low, to form a universe frame in which to think. The passage continues, if mind cannot fathom conclusions, if it cannot penetrate to true origins, then will such mind unfailingly postulate conclusions and invent origins, that it may have a means of logical thought within the frame of these mind-created postulates. And it concludes, and while such universe frames for creature thought are indispensable to rational intellectual operations, they are, without exception, erroneous to a greater or lesser degree. Frames of reference can be conscious or unconscious, helpful or unhelpful. They're tools which we must learn about and learn to use effectively. But frames of reference are peculiar tools because we're using them whether we're aware of them or not. Most of the time we're not aware of them. And unless our minds are extremely well trained so that we use these tools well without thinking about it, just like a highly skilled craftsman, then we're likely to build poorly, like the not-so-handy man who doesn't know when to use a screw instead of a nail, We may attempt to build with mental constructions and even life habits on ways of thinking that are not appropriate to the task, and will be disappointed by the results, and our constructions will not stand the test of time. Frames of reference are particularly relevant to anyone who wants to teach. Part of the teacher's job is to help the student to see the world with different eyes, to open him up to new possibilities, to show her other ways of looking at the world. It's not our job to put new facts into the minds of the students, but to help them to learn how to look at the world from new perspectives, to see the world anew, so that they can themselves go forth and help make a new world. Let's go back to Dr. Ransom on Mars for one more insight on frames of reference. After living on the planet for a short time with one of the 3 different rational mortal species on the planet, the Hrossa, here's an artist's conception. The Hrossa were friendly, but were so dissimilar from humans that he would, not surprisingly, periodically find himself gripped with fear in the presence of this alien species. We'll let Lewis pick up the narrative here. It was only many days later that Ransom discovered how to deal with these sudden losses of confidence. They arose when the rationality of the Hross tempted you to think of it as a man. Then it became abominable. A man 7 feet high, with a snaky body, covered face and all with thick black hair, and whiskered like a cat. But starting from the other end, you had an animal with everything an animal ought to have: glossy coat, liquid eye, sweet breath, and white as teeth. And added to all these, as though paradise had never been lost and earliest dreams were true, the charm of speech and reason. Nothing could be more disgusting than the one impression, nothing more delightful than the other. It all depended on the point of view. When you look about physically, mentally, or spiritually, how's your point of view created? What determines whether you see a frightening man or a wonderful animal? For this discussion, I'll propose that what you see and how you understand what you see is determined by these 6 factors. 1. What you are capable of seeing, the quality of your eyesight, of your perceiving mechanism, physical eyes, mental acuity, spiritual perception. This lies at the base. If your tools are not capable and well tuned, you may not be able to see anything at all. 2. What you've seen before, patterns you recognize, reference points you've been able to identify in the past. 3. What you expect to see, pre-existing interpretations, pre-existing frames of reference, what we think we're going to see. 4. What you're prepared to see. You may or may not be open to seeing something you've never seen before and which you didn't expect. 5. What you want to see, perhaps the most influential of all the elements. 6. What's actually there. This is last on the list for a reason. All too often, what's really in front of you is the last thing you see. The thing you think you're seeing directly, you're actually perceiving through the lenses of the other 5 elements. Do you think Jesus might have been referring to the combined effect of these elements of vision and thought when he conjured up the image of trying to put new wine into old wineskins? It's very difficult to set aside what you aren't even aware of. So it's hard to just say to yourself, I'm going to see things as they are, not as I imagine them to be. But if you self-consciously observe and think from different frames of reference than you usually do, by intentionally looking at things from points of view which are not your habitual ones, you can, by triangulation, begin to get a sense of the form and meaning of what's actually in front of your eyes or mind, to see reality more clearly. And you'll begin to develop a much better understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of your usual ways of looking at things. So we'll use the next 4 modules of this introductory course to explore frames of reference using the Urantia book itself as an object of study. We're going to examine it from several different points of view, not just as an exercise, but hopefully to provide you with 1 or 2 new ways of approaching the Urantia book. These are the 4 viewpoints we'll consider, since the Urantia book is, in fact, an artifact a book, a primary religious text, and perhaps your primary religious text. Each one of these perspectives may allow you to understand something new about the book, to ask questions of it you've never asked, to understand what it's saying and why in a way you haven't before. What qualities do all artifacts, as distinct from natural phenomena, have in common? Like this beautiful bust of Nefertiti, each has a time and place of origin, a historical and cultural context. Like this Greek amphora, given to the victors at the quadrennial Panathenaic Games, every artifact was designed and created using a particular set of technologies, which carried with them inherent qualities and limitations. An object may have been designed to provoke an emotion or religious attitude, even to inspire, like the windows of Saint-Chapelle. Objects may have a continuing political, cultural, or social impact from their time of origin right down to the present, like the Magna Carta, or the Declaration of Independence, or the Gettysburg Address. A continuing accretion of meaning and significance. These are not objects only of the past. Then we'll look at the Urantia book as a book. What characteristics do books have, and what challenges do they pose? Characteristics and challenges which the Urantia book shares with all other books. Well, all books have an author, someone who attempts to communicate something important through his or her writing. Here, St. Matthew from the 9th century Igbo Gospels is composing his book. And all communications have intended audiences. Some books are written for children, some for adults, some for people in one circumstance, some in another. All books have a language of origin, a language which shapes the expression of the author's ideas. Here, the first lines of Dante's Inferno. And all significant books have histories of interpretation, ways of thinking about them, from generally accepted interpretations to radical ones. Then we'll take a look at the Urantia book as a primary religious text, a particular kind of book. The Urantia book can be examined as a member of a small class of books that are believed to embody the Word of God, the divine message, standing at the end of a series which includes the Vedas, here 2 leaves from an 18th century copy, the Hebrew Scriptures. This is the great Isaiah scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The New Testament. This is the Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century. The Quran. Here is a 19th century copy. And the Urantia book. For this category of books, the interpretive tradition that might attach to any book takes on a special coloration and significance for both the wider culture and for those who are participants in a particular religious tradition. These texts also have an associated social history. They are the basis for various social groups and hence for the effects of those groups on the wider culture. Many of the events of history are directly related to them. What makes these different from all other books, of course, is that they have a unique authority for their adherents and have shaped entire civilizations. The Urantia book here would be in the future tense. And their contents become the shared property of the wider culture. And of course, the meaning of these works, unlike ordinary ones, is less dependent on what it says than on what others have done because of it and have thought about it. The tradition actually is the most significant factor in determining what the text itself actually means or has effectively meant. The last module of this series will look at the Urantia book as your primary religious text, a true revelation, a unique category in your own experience. Everything changes when you adopt a personal religious attitude toward a document, when it becomes your source of inspiration. Such a book is transitioned into something that deserves loyalty, that demands something of us, that is authoritative. What advantages and disadvantages does this bring? What routes of investigation or perspective of observation are now open to us? Which ones are now closed to us? Once again, the meaning and import of the interpretive tradition, in this case, your own history relative to the text, takes on an entirely new significance. What others have thought about some work at various times in history pales in significance to the history of your relationship with your own primary religious document. Finally, I'll leave you with a corollary to the assertion that frames of reference must change over time as one grows in understanding and maturity. The longer you've held a constant frame of reference, a particular way of thinking about or relating yourself to anything in this universe, the more likely it is that your viewpoint is immature, inaccurate, and ineffective. And you should grow out of it. Now, on to Module 2, Studying the Urantia book as an Artifact.